Please be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo and other engagement features. To set up a live demo, please complete the form above on our website. If you currently are not on our website and are watching this on our YouTube channel, there's a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Domain Names 101 Foundational Knowledge. My name is Christy DeMayo-Ziegler, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is Walt Fry and Molly McCormick. Walt is the Senior Director of Technology for Domains at CSC, responsible for developing the products and platforms that protect and optimize the domain portfolio of the world's largest companies. Molly is a product manager for domains at CSC, based in Wilmington, Delaware. With over a decade of experience in the domain industry, she brings a deep expertise in domain management and compliance, focused on delivering high-impact solutions to help clients manage complexities, ensure compliance, and protect their digital presence in an ever-evolving landscape. And with that, let's welcome Molly and Walt.
Okay, thank you, Christy, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today. Between us, Molly and I have over 30 years of experience in the domain name industry, and a lot has changed over that time. But one thing that is consistent is that we continue to receive questions and have discussions about really foundational information around domain names. What we've come to realize is that, the people that we're speaking with, don't have that information. It's not institutionalized, right? So, while people are doing many different things in their jobs, the domain names is not something that is always taught, right, and always well understood. So we wanted to have this webinar today to really put some of that information out there for those of you who may be new to domain names, even if you're not new to those areas that they touch. So we'll cover the history of domain names, how they have evolved over time since the beginning of that history. We'll take a look at the landscape, how domains are governed, and how some new regulations are changing the landscape as well. We're going to look at the life cycle, which may seem obvious on the surface, but within that life cycle, there are steps where whole businesses have been built around them, and so it's really key to understanding and managing the corporate domain portfolio. And finally, we're going to look at the usage of domain names, some obvious, some not so obvious, but it really paints a picture of the landscape and the ownership and really brings together all the things that we're going to discuss.
All right, so when we talk about the start of domains, we can bring it all the way back to the 60s and 70s. And back in the 60s and 70s, the scientists wanted to create a way to share resources between systems. So to do this, what they needed to do was assign what's called an IP address, which is a numerical address, to connect the systems and really talk about, or talk through, which system is talking to which system. And that worked for the 60s and 70s. But when you get into the 80s, you start to see the true foundation of IP addresses and DNS being laid out and the true domain industry really starting to form. So in the 80s, the domain name system was created to translate those numerical IP addresses into a text-based address to really help simplify the coordination between systems. So it's very similar to how today, when you are navigating through, a street or you're trying to get to a specific location, we use postal addresses and not, map coordinates. It really helps make it easier to remember, and you're not having to remember, multiple numerical digits to help locate where you're going. In the 80s, we also start to see the formation of different classifications of domains. This is all still part of the domain name industry today, but it was really formed in the 1980s. So we started to see classifications of domains, and those two categories really kind of simplified into what they're called GTLDs and CCTLDs. So a GTLD is a generic top-level domain. Those are things like your .coms, your .orgs, nets, or your .edus. And those were originally designed to categorize domains based off of the purpose of that represented entity. So if you were an educational institution, you were registering and securing a .edu. If you were more commercial, you're looking for a .com, really to represent your entity. The other classification that started to form is what's called CCTLDs, and that's also referred to as a country-coded top-level domain. And that signifies a country or even a geographic location, such as a .com or, a .co.uk for the United Kingdom, .au for Australia, .jp for Japan. So different countries or geographic territories started to register or hold TLDs and domains for their geographic location. When you get to the 1990s, you really start to see a change in the domain industry. So while that foundation is still there, right, you saw the landscape of the classifications, you started seeing the domain name system being utilized. When we get to the 90s, you really see an influx in the domain industry. There was a creation of the World Wide Web, a real investment in internet-based companies, and that just led to a demand for more and more domain names. So when you start looking at, the early 90s, at that time in 1992, there was probably only 15,000, maybe a little less, domains registered for a .com. And by the time you landed at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, there were over 20 million .coms registered. So the 90s was really, you saw that investment into the domain name industry.
It's interesting, Molly, to see the domain name as the technology, and it brings out some parallels to any emerging technology, and obviously the obvious one in today's world is AI. Whereas in the 80s, you have that technology, and it is technology of that name to that IP address mapping, but you don't have the technology to widely use it, right? Whereas, as you just described, the 90s, that technology emerges, and then you see that widespread usage.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that technology really advances into the 2000s. So as we go into the 2000s, there was a complete saturation of those domain names, but that technology is continuing to advance. While it started in the 90s, things like social media and emails really picked up in the early 2000s, but there was also a saturation of those domain names. So when you get to, early 2010s, right around 2010 2011, 2012, ICANN, which is a governing body for GTLDs, decided to launch a new program called the new GTLD program. And they started expanding all of the domain names to different, what we call TLDs or top level domains. And that just dramatically changed the landscape of the domain world. So previously your GTLDs were your .coms and nets, a pretty limited set of dot and then your TLDs. And in 2012, with the new GTLDs, this opened it up to new languages and new scripts, and really turning those .coms into even more specialized terms. So you started seeing .hotels or .cars, and then more geographic locations, registered their region, and you saw things like .NYC for New York City. There's a .Africa for all of Africa. You started to see that really pick up in the early 2010s, and then ICANN officially launched that in 2012. So
and throughout this, oh, I'm sorry, Molly.
That's all right. So, I mean, at this point, right, there's just about 1,500, if not more, TLDs across the globe. It really just completely expanded that landscape.
Yeah, and as you know, getting to that scale throughout this period, we see and have seen, and we even still see a shift in where corporate domains are managed within an organization, and I think that is really reflective of the evolving usage. You know, different parts of the organization were using them, and the organization saw them as serving different purposes, right? We came out of the 90s with commerce, and then you got into IP protection, and then it looked more technical, and now it's security. So you see these trends emerge, and it is all of those things, and always was and always will be. But I think part of that shift is why you don't have that institutional knowledge within any, perhaps one person if they haven't been in it for a while, or any one department.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of players in the domain name industry. And while the domain and the internet itself can seem like a pretty unruly place, there are governing bodies and organizations in play that help guide and keep the internet as secure as possible. So there's a couple of different governing bodies when you go back to those classifications. The GTLDs, or those generic top-level domains, are governed by a nonprofit called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. The industry calls them ICANN. And ICANN governs the GTLDs. So GTLDs are typically a little less restrictive, meaning that almost anyone can register them. The .com is no longer strictly for commercial use. Anybody can register that .com. But what ICANN does do is it regulates the stability and the security of the GTLD space, and that includes the IP address assignment and standards on who can be a registrar and sell domains. And then on the other side with CCTLDs, those are actually governed by the individual countries or representatives of those countries. So those governing bodies get to set their own requirements for their top-level domain. CCTLDs are typically a little bit more restrictive, meaning there are rules and requirements to registering and securing those domains. You have to remain in compliance. And that can range from anything as simple as being in that specific area and holding a local presence in that geographic location, or all the way down to, a low-level zone file requirement. So really on that DNS lower level requirements on how your configuration is set up and how your domain name is operating. So as the world and the industry continues to evolve, you're starting to see a lot more policies be reviewed. So both by ICANN and with the CCTLDs, you're seeing outside policies like NIS2 from the EU and all of the personal identifying information policies across the globe pop up. And you're starting to see all of these regulations start to change and adapt through CCTLDs and GTLDs both.
Yeah, it's interesting to see these bodies, these countries, or these organizations like the EU come to that realization after so many years that the domains are part of the security chain. So rather than just those restrictions that you were talking about, Molly, on who can register and how you register, these new regulations are in the security space, right? So they're looking at privacy, and they're looking at making sure that the people registering are who they say they are, because it is truly within the cybersecurity space.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we talked about, right, like all of this is constantly changing, but there are, the governing bodies in play, but there are other teams out there to help support and other organizations out there to support. So when you're looking at the domain industry, 3 of the key players are the registry, and that is, the business that sells the domain to the public. So while ICANN governs the domain name GTLD industry, individual registries help sell that and make sure that any requirements are met, and help, with the complete life cycle of that domain. And then there's the registrant, who is that end user. So the person or organization who is registering that domain, and going to, in the end, use it in one way or another. So they are securing it, they're paying for the renewal of it, and they're keeping it within their portfolio. And then in the middle is a registrar, and that's what CSC is. And CSC is an accredited registrar, and we have accreditations and partnerships with these registries. So while Walt and I talked through, the changing in the regulations, one of CSC's roles is to work with these registries to help understand what these policies are, make sure our awareness of any changes and restrictions or lessening of the restrictions, right? You see that both ways. But CSC is here to help support and manage those on behalf of other registrants and partner closely with those registries. So we play kind of in the middle to help secure the full life cycle of a domain.
Yeah, beyond just the nuts and bolts of the mechanics of being a registrar, it's registrars choose the business model. They choose how to do business, and so it's important to make sure you find the registrar that matches what your organization prioritizes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So when you look at the life cycle of a domain, the life cycle is that, right? It is cyclical, but each one of these phases have different layers. So as we are managing the life cycle of a domain and working with these registrants to manage them, each one of these phases has different intricacies that play a part in the full life cycle of the domain.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is the domain available? Is the domain you want available? And again, there have been different technologies to find them, to generate candidates. It all depends on what you're looking for. And so name is available. And again, if it's a CCTLD and you have to qualify for it in some way, if you can qualify, you can register it, keep it active, right? It's just continuing to renew that domain. And then if you don't want that domain anymore, then you can let that domain go. That domain expires. The key piece here is that should be an explicit choice that's based on key information.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So when you look to expire a domain, you want to partner with different teams within your organizations. Domains are used for a multitude of reasons within an organization. So you want to partner with, what we refer to as a digital governance council, and really partner across your organization to make sure before you're expiring something, really nobody is using it in a way that you're maybe not aware of.
And so, the domain will then go into this redemption grace period, and that is a period in which only the domain holder can get the domain back. There's an established process for that, right? And once it slips out of that period, then it queues up to be deleted. So it's not immediately deleted. And this pending delete phase is where there's a lot of activity happening, right, Molly?
Yeah, there's a lot happening here. And these domains don't just kind of slip into an expired or deleted status without anybody knowing. There's actually what there's called drop lists, and those are published lists of domains that are about to expire. So domain investors, cyber squatters, people are looking at those lists and looking for valuable domains that are about to possibly be deleted. And the value can range from, a true monetary value of that domain. Maybe it's a valuable brand. Maybe that's got some search optimization on it, right? The value comes in a lot of different ways, but people are looking at these drop lists and really anticipating to pick those up. If those names get picked up by somebody that does not own that brand, the organization does have to take an action to get that domain back. So when we talk about really understanding, the life cycle of a domain and what domains are used for, the Digital Governance Council within an organization can help make sure that all of these, different use cases for a domain are being reviewed before you are lapsing and then deleting a domain. So really the main use when people look at a domain, the first thing they think about is a website. You've got commerce websites, people are going to sell things and buy things. They can be used for community outreach, different philanthropy, but there's a whole, host of other reasons organizations use domains.
Yeah, so at the heart, as Molly described earlier, it is just about addressing, right? But that addressing can be things that are not public and things that a common web user would not see. So, increasingly so, they're being used for business functions, and it may be off of a domain that also has a public website or has email attached to it, right? Or it may not. So, for instance, at CSC during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw the DNS traffic. So DNS is really that address book, right? And a query to the DNS ultimately should resolve to something. But we saw that DNS traffic roughly triple. It wasn't because people were sitting at home browsing more websites. It was because of all the remote work and the need to connect remotely, the need to verify identities remotely, and then something like Microsoft 365, where people can use these products and these tools remotely and not have to be in an office on a network. And all of that is traffic that's through and to a domain name. A lot of integrations, obviously the world's very connected, companies are very connected, so there are partner integrations. And again, a lot of times what you see is companies will keep these off of their main domain names, and use something else to solidify and actually implement these partnerships. So it's important to consider that kind of strategy. How do you want to form these partnerships? How do you want to implement them, right? And what kind of domain names do you want to use? And then the internal hosting, whether it's just internal services, internal networks, or starting to look at those connective services, particularly for employees. And then intellectual property has always been a big part of domain names ever since companies started using them widely. And while, yes, the domain name ultimately, may be used when a product is launched, it has to be considered before even coming up with naming, and certainly before filing trademarks, right? It's important to properly secure the domain names first, because if any information gets out there through marketing, through trademark filings, then people will go and grab those domain names because now they're important and valuable properties. So that's why I'm discussing the domain names as intellectual property and product launches, because even if they're not being actively used, they need to be considered on their own prior to that launch happening. And then, of course, defensive registrations, domain names are protection. It is protection. Securing the domain names is protection for an organization if it's a live name or being used for email. But it's also protection, just to make sure that others aren't using them. And, the common threats today are things like phishing attacks. So different organizations have different strategies around that. We may discuss things like that in the future. But this is where the legal team really becomes part of that Digital Governance Council, or if the legal team is, directing it through the intellectual property angle, the security and the marketing teams, also become part of that Digital Governance Council along with them.